Welcome to Real Estate Radio Power Investing, an informative and engaging hour discussing everything you need to know about the world of real estate investing. Your host, Tom K. Wilson, provides you with insight and guidance from his years of experience as a successful real estate entrepreneur on how to buy, sell, finance, and invest in real estate, and much more.
Thanks for tuning in to our Real Estate Radio Power Investing program, where we empower you with
Tom
the
K.
education
Wilson.
to maximize your investing success. We're broadcasting from the #1 business radio station in the San Francisco Bay Area, KDOW AM 1220, the Wall Street Business Network. I'm Tom K. Wilson, your host for this weekly program on real estate investing. And if you can't make our live show, you can catch our podcast on TomWilsonProperties.com or on iTunes or on YouTube. You can go to TomWilsonProperties.com and look up all of the podcasts and special guests that we've had on over the years. This is our 5th year of broadcasting this program. And you can look up and listen to Robert Kiyosaki and Kenny McElroy and Bruce Norris and Dr. Doug Duncan and lots of other special guests on there that you can listen to. And also on TomWilsonProperties.com, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter that gives you economics news about what's going on in the world of real estate and different markets across the country and around the world. And you can also, by signing up, get access to our commercial syndication products that Wilson Investment Properties makes available. And most of these products are only available to our clients who are signed up with us, whether it's multifam or neighborhood service centers or office buildings or industrial. All of these products are available to our clients if you go to TomWilsonProperties.com and sign up. And of course, we always welcome your questions that we'd be glad to respond to or to meet with you if we can help you with any consulting. Today we have a very special guest that we had the pleasure of meeting a number of years ago and have seen several years since, G. Edwin Griffin. He is a author, lecturer, filmmaker on topics such as our monetary system, healthcare, and other political interests. He's probably best known for his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a sort of a Bible on the origination and history of the Federal Reserve Bank. He was a child voice actor, MC on a radio and program, and announcer on public radio in the past, has his bachelor's at University of Michigan, and he served in the U.S. Army. But he is a tremendous educator, speaks around the country on various topics, and we're so glad to have Ed on our program. Welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be on your program, and a pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you. We've enjoyed many hours and time with Ed on the Real Estate Guy Summit at Sea, and I've talked to him at other occasions, and it's long past due for having him on the program. Ed, tell us a little bit, if you will, about your background and how you kind of evolved and what planted the seeds. How did you evolve into being a researcher and an author?
Well, that's kind of it's a boring story, actually, but I suppose some people are interested in it, so I'll try and keep it. Instead of telling you the long, boring version, I'll give you the short, boring version. How's that? Basically, as you mentioned, Tom, I went to the University of Michigan, and I graduated from the Speech and Communications School. That was my intent, to go into television and motion picture production. I had these grandiose dreams. All kids going to school think they're going to automatically and certainly rise to the top of the career path they choose, not thinking too seriously about the reality of the real world out there and the obstacles and all that. So anyway, having said that, I was on a path, or so I thought, to make a career in Hollywood in some way, utilizing the experiences I'd had as a younger person in radio and then later in television. So when I came out to Hollywood. I came out of the Army after I served a couple of years there. I met Raymond Burr. Actually, I had something to do with putting on the USO tours that came through Fort Bliss, Texas.
Huh.
And so I met Raymond Burr, who is, he's best known, I suppose, for his TV series, but also he played the heavy in Rear Window, I think it was called. Anyway, so I met Ray Burr, and we talked. He said, well, when you get out of this man's army, come out to Hollywood, look me up, and introduce you around. Maybe we can find a little crack for you to get into. So naturally, I went out a few months later, out in Hollywood, when I was getting discharged from the Army. So I look up this telephone number, and I call it, and Ray answers the phone. I said, hi, Ray? Yeah? This is Ed Griffin. And a long silence. Who? I said, Griffin, remember we had a USO tour, and we had a few drinks one day at a bar, and we talked about the career. And silence. Oh yeah. How you doing, buddy? This sort of thing. Anyway, I had lunch with him. That was the end of that. So there I was in Hollywood. And,
well, at least it got you there.
It got me there. So, but this time I had a wife, and I had a kid, and I didn't have a job, but there was no worry. I had a couple $100 in the bank. I knew it wouldn't be long before I'd be head of one of the studios, so I started into that rat race there, and it didn't take long, Tom, before I knew that I could see that there was a lot better talent than mine in Hollywood, doing washing cars and bussing dishes, and they were kind of just wasting their lives waiting for their big chance. And it isn't that they didn't have talent, because they had plenty of talent. But I guess it's kind of like being a musician. There are lots of good musicians out there, but there aren't that many openings, you might say, or opportunities for a really good musician to become rich and famous. So that's the same way with acting and script writing and productions. So eventually, now I'm finally getting on the real track, is I decided I had to give up all this fantasy business and get a real job. So I'm probably taking too long on this, but so I got a job with a large insurance company. I was doing underwriting and sales assistance. I was creating group insurance policies and all of that. And I was in the corporate world. I was climbing the corporate ladder, or so I thought. I figured that all the old boys ahead of me in this particular company, I looked them all up. They were all ancient. They were getting ready for retirement, and I kind of scanned the executive list. I saw that there was a great shortage of young middle executives. So I figured when the old boys retired, they'd have to reach down pretty far in the ladder to fill those positions. So I thought, okay, I'm in position now. So you can see I was strategizing all this. Well, that didn't work either, because I finally then started to read some stuff, and I attended some meetings that told me that the future of this country and the future of the world was not too bright, that there were things going on that I needed to know about that were not in the news. Things were not as they seemed, and I became worried about the future of my country, the future of my family.
Oh, interesting. And that led to your interest in eventually finding about the Federal Reserve and the real story?
Yeah, that's it. I discovered I had a crusader gene that kicked in. And so I quit my job. My wife thought I'd gone insane, which I had. I started to produce little one-tank videos, or in those days we called them film strips. We didn't have video yet. Little documentaries and so forth. And I never knew I could write. I was always thinking of myself as an actor or a producer or something like that.
Interesting.
So then I had an illness come across me, and I couldn't move. I couldn't get around, and somebody asked me if I would be willing to write a book on the United Nations, which I had been speaking about. That was one of the topics I picked up and developed. And I said, me write? I was ready to say, no, I can't write. But since I was sort of incapacitated and I didn't have a job, so somebody said, can you write a book? I said, of course. I said, oh, naturally, no problem. So I took on the task, and it was a means of feeding my family, and I did all this research. I didn't know anything about research, but I started to read, really read for the first time. I never thought of myself as a reader, but I got into the swing of it, and I liked it. I began enjoying this process called learning. And anyway, to make a long story short, I discovered I could write. And that was a game changer, because it's like so many things, Tom. When tragedies hit you, like an illness or anything else, often they turn your life in a different direction, and you're looking back on it, you think, wow, what a wonderful thing that was for me.
Well, I'm glad a silver lining came out of that, and eventually it led to you researching and learning about the Federal Reserve, and you're writing the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. When was that book released, Ed?
Well, the first edition came out in 1994.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we've had 5 editions and about about 50 printings now. So it amazed me, and people are actually reading the darn thing. It's so huge, a 600-page book and on banking. Now, who wants to read that?
Well, it's become, for those that have not read it, if you want to know anything about our banking system and Federal Reserve and so forth, it has become the Bible that everyone refers to, and you have to read. Ed, we only have a couple of minutes left in this segment. Why don't you just introduce our listeners to what the Federal Reserve is, or maybe how it, maybe just an initial part of how it was formed and why?
Sure. Yeah. Let's cut to the chase and forget about the background of my getting to this point. Yeah. People need to know that the Federal Reserve is not a dry topic. After I got into it, I realized it was the embodiment of perhaps one of the greatest crimes ever committed in history. What we're dealing with here is not a government agency, as most people think, as I used to think. It's a cartel. It's no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It just happens to be a banking cartel. It's privately owned, even though it has the appearance of government. It has usurped some of the power of government. You can go to prison for not obeying the rules of this cartel because they got congressmen to pass the Federal Reserve Act, which took the cartel agreement, passed it into law. So now you and I have to obey a cartel agreement, or we go to prison, which is why we think it's government. But anyway, it's a mechanism for legalized plunder, and that's the short version of it. I urge anybody that really wants to understand why inflation is eating them alive, how come Congress and other branches of government can just spend endless amounts of money, and where do they get the money? They don't even question whether they can afford it. That's no longer an issue because they literally create the money, and that's the trick. People have to understand that money today is like creation on demand. It's like going to a print shop and say, well, today I want 3 books. Tomorrow I want 20 books. Next day I want 1,000, but today I just want 3 on demand. You walk in, get your books, and walk out. This is how they create money now. They just create it on demand. And that's the reason our economy is in such a sad mess. It's a reason inflation has destroyed the savings of the middle class. It's the reason the middle class is being squeezed into oblivion. It's one of the reasons we're having so much economic turmoil in the nation. And I think it's one of the reasons the country is going to collapse.
We'll be back in just a moment with more from Ed Griffin about the Federal Reserve and our monetary system. Stay with us.
Welcome back to Real Estate Radio Power Investing. Streaming live on iHeart, TuneIn, and KDOW.biz. For more information on today's topic or guest, visit TomWilsonProperties.com. That's TomWilsonProperties.com. Again, your host for today's edition of Real Estate Radio Power Investing, Tom K. Wilson.
We have with us today Jekyll Griffin, who is a researcher, author, and on topics such as the monetary system, healthcare, and other issues. And for our listeners, since this is a real estate investing program, we're focusing on the monetary system and the Federal Reserve. And Ed was just starting to give us a little background on the Federal Reserve and monetary system. So Ed, if you will, briefly, because I think it's such an interesting story, most people don't realize that the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913. Can you kind of give a little quick synopsis of why and how that happened?
Well, yeah, in fact, that's the most mysterious and interesting part of the story from the point of view of a storyteller.
It'd make a good movie, wouldn't it?
It would make a good movie. In fact, I've had a couple of people from Hollywood want to contract for the theme and the title to make a movie of it. And the interesting thing is, not only is it mysterious and dramatic, but it's real. And the story basically is that a group of the most powerful bankers in America got together back in 1910 and decided that they wanted to write a piece of legislation that supposedly, well, at least it would be sold to the voters, as a means of controlling those big bad banks, because there was a lot of concern on the part of the American public that the banks were out of control, the investment houses on Wall Street were out of control, they had too much power, and so forth. And so there was a pressure on Congress to pass some legislation to bring this sector of the economy, the very important sector of the economy, under control, so it would serve the people instead of exploiting the people. So the bankers decided, well, you're not going to stop this movement, so rather than oppose it, let's lead it. So they got in front of the parade and said, yeah, we're going to support legislation to improve banking and to control the bad elements in banking. But they didn't want the world to know that the legislation that was being drafted was written by them. That would have been a pretty good giveaway, It's like asking the fox to guard the hen house and install the security system. So they had to conceal the fact that this legislation was being hammered together by their own agents. And so they went to a very private location called Jekyll Island. It's off the coast of Georgia. It was a resort island in those days, still is, but now it's owned by the government of Georgia, where in those days it was privately owned, by this very group of big billionaire bankers and industrialists. It was their resort island. They had cottages there, they called them, but they were mansions. They had a huge clubhouse, which is still there, called the Jekyll Island Clubhouse, and that's where they went, and they sat around a table there.
And they went there in the middle of the night on separate trains, right?
Well, no, they all got on the same train.
Oh, they did.
They arrived at the train station in Hoboken, New Jersey, quite late, just a little bit before midnight. And, they boarded the private railroad car of Senator Nelson Aldrich. He was one of the people that went to that island. In fact, he was more or less the one that organized the meeting. Aldrich was deeply involved in banking at that time, one of the richest men in the country, had a private railroad car. So he invited these six guys to come together, and they went under conditions of great secrecy. You're quite right. They traveled separately to the train station. When they got there, they were told not to talk to each other, not to even acknowledge each other. They were told to avoid reporters if any were there. And one of them even carried a shotgun in a big black case. So just in case someone had asked him where he was going, he was prepared to say, I'm going on a duck hunting trip. Well, we find that was Schiff, and we find out that he never fired a gun in his life. That was not even his gun. So it was all part of this deception. And when they even got on board the train, they were instructed to use first names only in addressing each other and avoid last names. And we find out later from some of the papers and books written by these people that the reason for that was that they were concerned that the servants on board the train would figure out who all these people were and that they might talk. And if the word ever got out in any fashion that all of these bankers, the top of the industry, were all together, for a week, it would have raised some eyebrows. And so, anyway, I'm trying to condense the thing. There was a great deal of secrecy surrounding this because it was imperative that the public and Congress not be aware that this reform legislation that supposedly was going to control banking on behalf of the people was secretly being written by the bankers themselves.
All right, stay tuned here for the rest of the story, as they say. We'll be back with Ed in just a moment for more about how the Federal Reserve got founded, why, and where it is today. Stay with us on KDOW 1220 AM.
Welcome back to Real Estate Radio Power Investing. Streaming live on iHeart, TuneIn, and KDOW.biz. For more information on today's topic or guest, visit TomWilsonProperties.com. That's TomWilsonProperties.com. Again, your host for today's edition of Real Estate Radio Power Investing, Tom K. Wilson.
Talking with Ed Griffin here about the Federal Reserve and how it was formed. So, Ed, they got together on Jekyll Island, and they sketched out what was to be the basically the Constitution for this Federal Reserve, new entity that was going to hopefully control things more in their advantage than if they had left it up to the general public. Is that the essence of it?
And that's exactly it, because they knew that if they didn't do it themselves, it was going to be done by somebody, and they didn't trust Congress. They thought that, heck, there might even be some congressmen there that would want to serve America, and that wouldn't do. They didn't want anybody representing the country or the people interfering with their nice little plan of how to create money out of nothing and charge interest on it. How to charge interest on nothing. That's what the plan was all about. So they decided to draft their own cartel agreement. And what they did then is they went back to Washington, or at least, some of them were just bankers. They went back to New York. But Aldrich went back to Washington. He was the chairman of the committee that was given the job to create this legislation. And you can just imagine, figuratively at least, they took an eraser and they erased the top of the page which said Banking Cartel Agreement. Okay, they erased that, and then they wrote in Federal Reserve Act. Okay, now you got an idea of what actually happened. This agreement, this cartel agreement, became law. It was finally passed 3 years later in 1913, and it was sold to the people as a means of controlling the banks. It was the law of the land, and it was written by the bankers themselves to make sure that they could maintain a monopoly.
And the Federal Reserve Bank is not federal. It has no reserves, and it's not a bank.
That is correct. It's a cartel. And it's as simple as that. And the people have been taught to revere this thing as a great American institution, when in fact, if we had to condense this whole story down to one sentence, in fact, I can condense the whole story down into 3 words, and it's this: it's a scam.
Are there any benefits to the general public that have come out of this?
Well, that's a good question. There might be. It's hard for me to think along those lines. I'll tell you a little story that, and I know we don't have a lot of time in this segment, but when I wrote the book, I was scared to death that, being a neophyte as I was to banking, I had to learn everything as I went. I said, oh man, I'm sure I've messed this up somehow. Some college professor is going to get me someday and catch me on a mistake. And the day finally came when I was in a radio station back on the East Coast. I was supposed to be talking about my book. I walk into the studio, and there's a college professor. He's going to share the program with me. So it turned out to be a debate, and I wasn't prepared for it. Wouldn't have made any difference. But I thought, oh, here's my day of reckoning. This professor is going to chew me to pieces. Well, after I told my little story about this Federal Reserve being a scam, how they create money out of nothing, et cetera, I went down the list. I thought, okay, now he's going to chew me up. And so the microphone passed to him, and he paused, and he says, well, what you say is true, but we're living well, aren't we?
And you would probably say, well, maybe in spite of that, huh?
Well, not only that, but not everybody is living well.
Okay.
Some people are living a lot better than others. Those who are in the take live very well indeed, and there is momentum. And even if everybody seems to be living well at the moment, you got to look at the long view. These things tend to be bubbles, and bubbles burst. And when the bubbles burst, a lot of people are not doing very well at all.
We'll be back with Ed Griffin here in just a moment for more of the story.
Welcome back to Real Estate Radio Power Investing. Streaming live on iHeart, TuneIn, and KDOW.biz. For more information on today's topic or guest, visit TomWilsonProperties.com. That's TomWilsonProperties.com. Again, your host for today's edition of Real Estate Radio Power Investing, Tom K. Wilson.
So we have Ed Griffin on with us today, monetary system expert and author. Ed, if I may, if I can give you some kind of rapid-fire questions and just give us a brief answer, and then maybe we can have you back on to expand on some of these. Do you think it was a good thing or bad thing that we bailed out the banks and Fannie and Freddie and GM and all that in the crash?
Well, I think it's a horrible thing because while we bailed out that sector of the society, and it can be argued that, well, the banks, if they fail, why the country's going to be severely damaged. And you could make a case for that. I think it's a greatly exaggerated case because I think that banks basically deserve no more consideration than any other business. You can make a case that everybody's business is essential to the nation in some way. So why do some businesses get bailed out and others don't? And bailed out simply means that the money is taken from everybody else and given to them.
Yep.
Now, if the money was just given to the banks by some very wealthy person or institution that had the money, and they said, we just want to do this because it's our patriotic duty or our humanitarian instinct to do this, I'm all for bailing out the banks. But that's not how it works. It's kind of a legalized plunder. They say, okay, the banks made all these bad decisions, and we know that they consciously made those bad decisions, anticipating that they're going to be bailed out by the taxpayer. But forgetting that part, so the banks made these bad decisions. So poor guys, we gotta help them out if we want the banking system to continue to work. And so we're not going to give them our money, though. We're going to go to everybody else, and through coercion, taxation, inflation, we're going to just take the money from everybody, whether they want to give it or not, and put it into the bank's coffers. I think ethically, morally, economically, at every level you look at it, it was a bad move. For one thing, it told the banks that they can continue to do these same practices, and no matter how bad their practices are, no matter how fraudulent they are. And don't forget that part. This is not just making a mistake. There's fraud involved here. No matter what, they're going to have the government go at the point of a gun and take the money away from every citizen who's working like a fiend trying to get along and just pay his bills and give that money to the banksters.
And now we have even bigger banks to fail.
Now we have
right?
bigger banks and bigger fraud
okay.
and bigger deficits and bigger failures.
Do you think we're at risk of losing the world reserve currency?
Oh, I think it's not only at risk of losing that status, it's inevitable that the American dollar will, at some point in the future, not be the world reserve currency any longer.
Will you explain to our listeners the difference between currency and money? And
Well, that's a tricky thing because people do have different definitions in their mind when they use those words. But I'll just tell you what I have in my mind when I use those words. I think they're pretty fundamental issues. Currency is merely what people is something you hold in your hand. It's currency. It's like a paper bill or a coin. That's how most people consider currency. It's a physical thing. But money can be intangible, and in fact, most of it is. When you write a check, it's not really that piece of paper that's the currency. It's the digital account that's behind it. It's money is anything that can be exchanged as a medium of exchange. That's the classic definition of it. So, and then you get to the question, well, there's good money and bad money. Good money is something, in my view, that has intrinsic value, whether it's used for money or not. That would be something tangible, something as an asset. Gold and silver always, throughout history, finds that position, not because governments decree it, but because people choose it.
If you were dictator, would you get us back on the gold standard?
If I were a dictator, well, it depends on what kind of a dictator.
A good one.
There's no such thing. But if I had the power to make the decision, I would definitely get us. I was going to say I would definitely get this on the gold standard. But what I would really want to do, because of my philosophy, I would want to give people a choice. I don't want to pass a law and say, I have decided in my infinite wisdom this is the best thing, even though I think the gold standard would be the best thing. But I'm not going to force everybody to follow my views. But what I would like to do is say, I want everyone to have an option to accept gold or silver as money or to accept fiat currency if they're stupid enough to do that. But I don't want to force them to do what is right.
A little bit like, do you force people to wear helmets on motorcycles, or do you just educate them and let them make a decision? Right?
Yes, like forcing people to wear earmuffs in sub-cold weather.
Yeah. Do you think? Well, would you disband the Federal Reserve immediately, or would you phase it out over time if you had control of that decision?
Well, I'd have to seek technical advice on that, but I'm sure that the advice would be it needed to be phased out rather than just disbanded, because I think that would be very disruptive. People are dependent upon the flow of the federal the fiat currency, and just to suddenly say, well, that's not going to be used anymore, would mean that there'd be no money in circulation.
Yep.
So that would be kind of devastating. So it would have to be phased out.
At what risk are we of monetary collapse?
We're at total risk, and to me, it's just a question of time, because this is a house of cards, and I think anybody can see that. It's just that professor I was talking about a moment ago would say, well, we're living well, aren't we? As long as the house of cards is still standing, it's okay. But the fact is, it is a house of cards.
And do you think that risk is within months or years, or?
Oh, I don't know about that. I used to make silly predictions like that, but I was always wrong. I was never wrong on what was going to happen, but I was usually wrong as to the date. So I've finally learned to stay away from dates.
Our friend Doug Duncan says that when he makes predictions and he gets it right, he tries not to act surprised. We'll be back with Ed Griffin in just a minute for a wrap up. Stay with us here on Real Estate Radio Power Investing on KDOW AM 1220 Business Network. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Real Estate Radio Power Investing. Streaming live on iHeart, TuneIn, and KDOW.biz. For more information on today's topic or guest, visit TomWilsonProperties.com. That's TomWilsonProperties.com. Again, your host for today's edition of Real Estate Radio Power Investing, Tom K. Wilson.
Been great having G. Eben Griffin on with us today, and just a reminder to go to TomWilsonProperties.com to sign up for our weekly newsletter on real estate and investing and the economics as it applies to it. I've learned over the years, and especially from folks like Ed Griffin, how important it is to understand economics better to help us make better decisions. Ed, you've got a project you're working on that you'd like to tell us about, I believe.
Well, yes, Tom, thank you. I've got lots of projects, and you can't go into all of them. So let me just start by inviting people, if they want to find out what I'm up to. The best place to begin that journey is to get our free news service, which we call Need to Know News. And so if you want to write this down, it's simple. It's needtoknow.news. Needtoknow.news, and that's our news service. We have stories and commentary every day coming out.
And it's terrific. I highly recommend it.
Oh, well, thanks, Tom. Thank you. And if anybody wants to get it coming to their email regularly, you can enroll right at the top of that page. So that gets you into the information flow. Now, we do have a commercial site where we sell books and recordings and things to back up the things we say, and that is realityzone.com. realityzone.com. And then finally, we have this think tank operation where we talk about, we have nothing to sell but ideas, and we talk about how to straighten up the mess if we can. And that's our organization called freedomforceinternational.org. So between those three, there's plenty to do, plenty to learn, plenty to read, and I invite your listeners to try all three of them, and I'd be happy to communicate with anybody that wants to pursue these issues personally.
Thank you. And is there anything in particular you want to point them to right now, or do you have any closing comments? Maybe That's the resources they can go to. Any closing comments about how do people deal with this issue of us being in high financial risk right now? How can they defend and how can they capitalize?
Well, yeah, my message is simple, and it's a little bit unpopular, I might say, and that is that there are ways that you can defend yourself against some of these negative economic influences. And you can get into tangible assets. Real estate is a wonderful defense. You want to get out of money. National currencies are losing their value by the minute. So it's crazy to stay invested in money or money-denominated instruments. Real estate is very good. Gold and silver. I say if you could buy a warehouse full of cheap white wine, it'd be wonderful because these are tangible assets. And that's where people should go for that. But now the unpopular part is that none of that's going to make any difference if the system totally collapses, because that'll put us into a totalitarian regime of the worst order, and then nobody's going to come out looking good on that. So people have to take an interest in how to restore the system, the free market system. If we don't do that, then there's no long-term survival in this. So
thank you, Ed.
That's where we have to work.
Thank you so much for being on the program. And if you like and very interested in things you've heard today, go to those different websites that Ed mentioned, and you'll get a lot of tremendous information that he shares. Not only he writes, but he finds for us and publishes for us. So again, go to TomWilsonProperties.com, sign up for our weekly newsletter. It gives you access to our commercial syndications and things you can invest in real, tangible real estate assets. And Ed, thank you so much for being on the program. We look forward to having you back. And remember, the only thing that matters is what you do next.